Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Morning Minutes. Myself, Michael Bergio, James Lampow. Today, we're talking about a very, very interesting article we've read where Apra could be reducing the purchasers' borrowing power from 10 to 20%, and what type of effects that would have in the marketplace. Who is Apra? How would this be done? How quickly can this be done? And basically, how can you plan for it? James, good morning.
Good morning, Michael. Yeah, look, this is a good one. I think there's probably a lot of people in the dark about this, so let's get into it.
Yeah, so let's just, before we get into the weeds of how and who and all that stuff, but just think of all the buyers you're dealing with. We'll sort of just stick to residential, but 10 to 20%. So $1 million purchase, I said in the ad, 1.45 million down to 122. Do you think that would have a big impact? Like, have people, like when someone's buying, how close to what they're being approved to spend are they spending? What would 20% mean?
Yeah, well, look, in this market where it's been volatile to say the least, there's been ridiculous capital growth. People are pushing themselves really, really hard, and properties are going for far more expensive prices than we probably would have considered 3 months, 6 months, 12 months ago. So that's meaning that they're having to move further for the same property anyway, or they're having to push even further again against all the competition because of the lack of stock. So people that might have had a 1.22 budget are probably looking, or approvals are probably spending on the very top end of that, and it's getting very, very close to the limit.
And even with that, even regardless of a market going up, just people just, if they get $1 million to spend, they're looking to spend $1 million. Like, I know as an agent, they're not going to say, hey, I'm going to approve for 1.5, but I only want to spend $1 million. But we've both dealt with enough clients on it where we have phenomenal rapport, and they're like, I'm approved for $1 million. What can I get for as high as that? It's almost been in our nature to spend as much as the bank will give us.
Yeah, well, that's right. And people look at it as your property purchase is something that for the most part, you're going to be there for a very long time. You're going to get a lot of use out of it. A big thing through the last 18 months has been offering yourself a slightly better quality of life, probably through your property as the foundation. So they're stretching themselves for that so that they can afford that whilst they're working from home or whatever the new circumstances are. So yes, there's a lot of reasons or a lot of catalysts as to why people are pushing it. But I must say, right, you probably see 1 in 5 people spend 20 or 10% less than their actual capacity. 4 out of 5 people are spending on the actual brink of what the banks are going to say. You're pushing it too far.
Yes, and I want to also, people, like, we've had phenomenal growth. What really sparks this conversation, it's almost what happened in 2018-19, big surge in the market. But people look to, because the banks and the RBA are like, we're not going to raise interest rates till basically 2024. So when people hear that, they think this gravy train is running for another couple of years. This is awesome. We've had, I remember at one stage, Newport, an area with a median house price of 1.5 went up 70%. And people know that's very strongly because interest rates are 1.7 to 2%. And when they hear the RBA is not going to increase it, they hear the banks aren't going to, they're looking to basically keep it low as well. That is going to keep running, but it's just not the case. There are many levers that can reduce what you can borrow without the interest rate changing. So, for example, if you're, say, earning, these figures are just whole figures to make it easier. If you're earning 50 grand a year and you're getting 2% interest rate and they'll give you $1 million, there's a lot of things they can do so you can only borrow 800 grand, but you've kept the public rate at 2%. Because, James, how much is sentiment play into it? Like, when you're speaking to buyers and they see clearance rates high or talks of clearance rates going low or interest rates up or down, how often is something to do with sentiment coming out of a buyer's mouth when they're viewing property?
Yeah, and I think it's surrounded by all of the hype in the media that they're talking, as you just mentioned, about interest rates and capital growth that some of these suburbs are seeing. Like, people are just desperate to get into it, and they're doing anything to purchase no matter what. And it doesn't really, what I feel is they're not maybe looking at the long-term potential ramifications of what this decision means if you really do go to the very top of your capacity. That's based on figures that you've got here now. By the sounds of things, there are things that can be due for that to be flipped on its head a little bit, which is quite scary. So I think they're not, and they're not thinking about the unknown side of it. They're thinking about the black and white that they can see. But unfortunately, there's a lot of small print that you get caught in, and I think it's happened to people over the years. It's an interesting one.
Just to elaborate on what James is talking about, he's not talking about like the market crashing and shit hits the floor, about not thinking further ahead or just assessing it on today's parameters. What James is referring to is you're buying a property, you can afford it with interest rates being 2%. What happens if those rates go up to 3%, 4%? You love a property. You thought it was going to be $1 million. You went crazy. You spent 1.5. You love it. You can just afford that. As we said before, a lot of people are buying at their top, if not even more than what they can. But the slightest fluctuation of a rate, because let's say, I would love to hear an economist say, what is the healthy interest rates? We were between 4 to 7%. Probably for the last decade and longer, about 15 years, we were around that period. So was that always too high and we'll get it, and it was crap for us and we're just getting ripped? Or is that the healthy amount that it should be? So it'd be very interesting to know on a whole economy scale where it's good for it to be. Now, that's what Apra does. So I've just put in the chat the role of Apra. So Apra basically can change things. Like, you've got the RBA that sets the rate, but Apra can do the compliance and other changes. But let's read out the definition. Where was it? What does it say? Apra is Australian regulator authority, is Australia's financial system regulator, is responsible for promoting the prudent management and regulate institutions. Okay, perfect. So they have a big say in what can be done. Now, what happened a couple of years ago, which really surged this property market, and I'm going to share the screen to this article, which really got the conversation going. It's by Radom Seed on LinkedIn. Have a look. I'll put the article in this here. And this is where he said, how APRA will reduce your borrowing power. Can you see that fine, James? Or should I zoom? I'll zoom in a bit.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
House price growth approaching a multi-decade high. Regulators are now planning reduction to overall borrowing capacity. We expect intervention may lower owner-occupier borrowing power by 15% and investors by 10%. On balance, lending standards remain robust despite increasing house prices. There has been an increase. Now, having great property growth, that's not the issue. Like, it's one part, but this is where the issue is, where it can have an unstable economy, where America went through it. It goes, there has been an increase in the number of borrowers with high debt to income ratios and small servicing buffers. That's the key thing out of this whole thing, because people may think, well, what's wrong with it going up? There's nothing wrong with the market going up, but the buffer is the most important thing. And in this article, it refers to 2019 where they made the change. They made the change of there's names for it, like the floor. So let's, for example, you get a loan, you're paying 2% interest. Previously, they would want the buffer to go, okay, we know you're going to physically pay now if we give you this loan, 20 grand a year, 2%. Let's just go for that. But we're going to assess it if you can afford it if the rates are 5%, 6.5%. Normally it's a 2.5% buffer, because things can go up and down, and you don't want to get a loan today that the smallest change, you won't be able to afford it. And where this will really could really catch out a lot of people is, you've bought a property for say $2 million, or you're looking to spend 2 million, went crazy at auction, spent 2.5. In your mindset, you go 2% on 500 grand. That's okay. It's only 10 grand a year on top of the 40, 50 grand you can afford that. But interest rates go back up to, like, you're going to have this property for probably 10 to 20 years. So you look back to 5 years ago, rates were 4.5%. So now instead of paying 50 grand a year in interest, you're paying 120,000 and you may not be able to service it. And that's where a lot of people could get stung. And that's why they had these buffers into it. Like and let me show you this as well, because he goes through the options, the graphs of where it's been from 2009, 2021. So here he goes, figure 1. Overall loan to value ratio. Wait, I want to go through option 1. Yeah, so here it is. This is how it could be done through option 1. There's 4 options laid out in this article, which is phenomenal. Option 1, increasing the assessment rate buffers banks use to assess your borrowing capacity. In the mid-2019, Apra removed the floor buffer on assessment rates and allowed a floating assessment rate of 2.5%. The interest rate. So if you're paying 2.5, it was 5% you had to afford. By them, what they call it, by them moving it to a floating assessment rate, this boosted borrowing power by 20%. So overnight, a buyer who could borrow 1 million could now borrow 1.2. So, like, James, you think how much that would have affected on the ground on the property market? If everyone's got, like, what in your view, what's going to happen if everyone gets an extra 20% without saving it, without really doing anything? How's that going to be on the weekend when you're negotiating?
Oh, 100%. People get carried away, and we're all guilty of it to a degree, whatever we're doing. But again, it's like, as you say, if you've got it, typically people's nature, not everyone's, is to spend it. And there are people that are more sensible with their decision making, but there are a lot of people that would be in auction environments in situations where, as you say, they get emotionally connected to it. All of a sudden, you do hit the top, and then it's a very different kind of deal. Spending $1 million to $1.2 million, spending a fifth or a sixth more, without even a thought process about it. You probably don't even go and assess the long-term financial effects for your own pocket of if you do spend that 1.2 instead. You just say, right, well, they said I can, and it's all good. I'm clear.
That's a very good point. Like, imagine this, as you said, auction. You went there on, obviously it doesn't happen this quickly, but this is, I'm showing you I'm explaining the positive effects. You go to you were looking at an apartment, you loved it, you had $1 million approval, 10 other buyers had $1 million approval as well. The borrowing capacity changed. They could now borrow 1.2. So the auction starts at 900 grand. It hits that million where you would think it would normally be sold. All the other buyers would drop out. There's one buyer with, say, 1,010,000. Instead of him being able to buy that, and instead of that going at what the market was, now those buyers could be bidding all the way up to 1.2. So without any sort of, basically, due to compliance and regulations, that value of that property has gone up by 20%, just like without it really going up 20%, if you know what I mean. Like it's a huge impact. And let me show you, well, that's already 14 minutes. So we could probably do a lot more of these options. James, so I've put the link to this article. There's option 3 where there's other ways to do it. I think it's worth a read. There's one here saying how to prepare for this. If you plan on maximizing your borrowing capacity, it may be worth doing it sooner rather than later. This is likely to be particular in Sydney and Melbourne, where owner-occupied borrowing looking to maximize. And that's right. So people, if you think the market's, see, this is the thing. Yes, pricing is crazy right now, and a lot of people are waiting for the hope that the market goes down. But what happens if the market stays steady, but your borrowing capacity drops by 20%? Because keep in mind, once you've bought the property, you're very settled. Like they're not going to change it on you once you've bought it. But let's say if you had the capacity of buy, you had an approval for $2 million to buy a house, and you weren't happy with that because you've been looking for 6 months and they used to be 1.5. 1.7. So you hold off hoping it comes back 100 grand. But what happens if your borrowing power goes from 200 to 1.8 and the market sits, instead of continuing to go up, it just sits? You've missed out. So I think buyers really need to be aware of this. As much as we can all jump on board and say how great this growth is, as Mark and I have said on the show, James, we've said in meetings in the office, to have 50 to 70% growth in a year is not sustainable. So there will be changes. And so there are different levers. They can raise interest rates. They can basically say you've got to earn more to get the same loan you could have got before. They can do a lot of things to keep it stable. And this isn't a bad thing. Like, James, it's not a bad thing that there's bodies out there regulating this so it's sustainable. We want to have a good 100 years of property, not just a good 1 year sort of thing. So,
and this is the thing, and I think it's worth mentioning. We're certainly not trying to fearmonger. We're trying to just educate and make people aware of what's happening around us, because most people aren't going to be looking at these sorts of articles and documents. Second thing is worth noting is, if you're waiting for the market, the likelihood of, regardless of the growth, I don't think we've ever seen a drop. So timing the market is something that's probably not possible to have it down to chance. So it's just one of those things that just look closely, speak to your accountant, speak to your broker, and just don't stretch yourself too hard. I think that's one of the main things. It's looking at the sustainability. Regardless of the growth, if you're holding your asset for a long time, the market's going to equalize in the next sort of cycle, and you won't be overpaying for it 10 years later. It'll all sort of work out, but just be very careful with the way you're balancing your books at the start.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You've just got to know and be educated on both sides. So I've popped the link of this article. There are a lot more points in there, but we already went through the time today. Any questions, let me know. I think reach out to the gentleman who wrote the article, LinkedIn, phenomenal article. I've shared it on my timeline. I popped the link there. So be aware and be prepared and plan accordingly. So I want to thank everyone for watching this morning, and we'll be back tomorrow morning.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks.